Students, hello. Risk management. We want to get started with risk management. I've owed you a lecture on risk management, and so let's get started. So when we think about risk, the first thing that we want to do is we want to take our work breakdown structure. We want to get our teams together, and we want to generate and brainstorm a list. So the first thing that we do, now that we've gotten to the project, now that we've got a pretty good feel for that project, we want to identify risks, okay? So first thing we want to do, number one, is identify risks. And this is always a fun part of the project when we think about wanting to identify risks. And that is because we can get together as teams. Now, I know there's the challenge of the virtual need that we don't get together physically and have a roundtable. But if you can, that's the ideal, even if it's in a virtual environment. If not, maybe what we do is we brainstorm ideas. Maybe you find someone who can be responsible to collect everyone's brainstorm of risks for the project. And that person collects them, categorizes them, and then redistributes them to the rest of the team. And when we want to do that redistribution, what do we want to do? Well, when you receive that redistribution, when you receive the categorization of the risks that you've listed, well, we really haven't done anything other than identify risks and categorize them. So the next thing we need the teams to do is each person needs to look at that risk and they need to weigh that risk. We need to assess that risk and get an idea of likely what that impact might be to the project. So the next thing we want to do is we want to assess. We want to assess risk, or what I like to say that we like to weigh it. We like to see which risk is heavier than the others, which one is going to be something we really need to pay attention to. So I'm going to say we like to weigh the risk. Right? And so there's a number of ways that we could go about weighing that risk. Well, the first thing that we want to think about when we weigh risk is we kind of want to get an idea if that risk event should happen, how severe, right? Kind of a severity matrix. And I know the text speaks of something like that, and I think that's a really cool idea. So when you do a severity matrix, I think what you want to do is you've got your X and you've got your Y axes. And we really want to kind of maybe take the vertical axes and be that the probability of that risk event occurring. However you give that value to that risk, whatever that probability might be. And then we down here, maybe on the X timeline, maybe we want to call that the impact of that risk. So when you have probability against impact, you're going to have an identification of a number of areas here that you're going to want to speak to. And you can do this in a number of ways. And in this particular way that I'm doing this is I'm just kind of arbitrarily, setting up quadrants of this what we'll call a severity matrix. And so if you have a risk that's been identified, let's just call it risk A. Okay, risk A, let's say, is an activity. Risk A is an event that has an 80% chance of occurring. Okay, and so if this is our scale of percentage, we call this 100, we call this 0. So 80%, kind of, is roughly around this way, on our y-axis. So we have an 80% chance of the risk of happening. So what may that impact of that risk be? Well, maybe the impact of that risk is, we'll give it a scale of 1 to 5, maybe 5 being the highest impact and 1 being really, really minimal impact. And so let's give it a scale of 3, right? So if we go down here and let's call this 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, well, we've got an 80% probability of risk A event occurring, and it has an impact, we said, of 3. So we'll just put it right here on the matrix. And what you'll need to decide as a team is what does it mean in terms of relative severity. So if you've got a risk event of 80% chance of occurring, and the severity matrix that you've all decided on is going to be a 3, and you've identified it in this particular location, when you look at the area of your matrix, what does that area going to tell you? So for example, was that area going to be a area perhaps that I will show here in purple pen that is a, maybe this area is an area of moderate risk. So as you begin to evaluate more risk and you find risk landing in that moderate risk area, what do you do about moderate risk, right? So this is a tool that might be useful for your teams as you have, one, identified your risk, that you had perhaps a responsible team member who you have delegated responsibility to perhaps take your brainstorming efforts, categorize those brainstorming efforts, and now redistribute it to the team with the request that each should develop a severity matrix. Or even better yet, maybe you have the team collectively develop that severity matrix and then take those categorized risks that are a result of your brainstorming session when you identified those risks and begin to collectively, as your team, place them on the severity matrix. So you may have a moderate severity area that some of these risks may fall in. And that leads us then to the next piece of risk management and how we assess risk. And that is how do we then, once we've addressed it, identified its severity, how do we respond to that risk, right? How do we look at that risk and respond to it? And so there are a couple ways that I like to share with students that are easy ways to remember how to respond to risk. One is that it matters to respond to risk. Now remember the word matter, okay? Matter is as follows. I'm going to show you here. In fact, I'll list it right now. That the third thing we want to do is we want to be able to respond to risk. Now that we've identified and assessed and weighed the risk, we want to be able to respond to it, right? So how can we respond to this risk? Well, I told you that it matters. And I'm going to have a funny English way of writing matter, right? I'm going to write it this way. I'm going to write it M-A-T and R, okay? It matters, M-A-T-R, matter. And so what we want to do is, one way to respond to risk is that we mitigate risk. Okay? To mitigate is just what it means, is to lessen the impact, to be able to have a plan in place, to know that you've identified the risk and weighed it, that now you put together a plan to mitigate that risk, right? The next thing you could do, if the risk is certainly very severe, is you could avoid that risk altogether. So when you avoid a risk, what you do is maybe you go back, you look at the scope of the work, and you ask yourself maybe how could it be that we could avoid this risk? Maybe we change that scope in a certain way where that risk is avoided altogether. Or maybe that risk has such a huge impact that the project isn't beneficial or worth doing. So that's something to think about as you go forward when you look at risk is, do we avoid that risk altogether? Or how do we make adjustments to the scope if we avoid that risk? This is one you all will certainly relate to, and this risk is transfer. So we can transfer risk. That is, we will pay someone else through some sort of contract and transfer that risk. And how we can relate to that is that we all, or most of you should, if you don't, you probably should, have insurance. As when we drive cars, we have insurance. And so insurance is in the event of an accident, in the event that a risk event such as an accident should occur, that you're able to transfer that risk to another party, and that party then will manage and take care of that risk for you. So that's another way to think about risk. In fact, I'm going to kind of give you a heads up. One way to transfer risk is through contracts. Contracts that if you as an organization are unable to self-perform a particular type of work, well, typically, as general contractors do, they will subcontract that work out. Contractor still carries the risks for a successful completion of the project, but that subcontractor will carry the risk to perform that particular scope of work. So that's something to keep in mind, as I know this week you're going to be reading about contracts and actually responding to a discussion board that speaks to contracts. So T is for transfer. You transfer that risk. And last is R. R is retain. And retain a risk is to accept the risk, right? So really what we're saying is we accept the risk, or the risk is of such a minimal impact, if any impact at all, if the event should occur, that we're able to just deal with it, be able to accept it, and not have any worries about it if it should become an event within the project. So retain is essentially to accept the risk, but retain is a great word that works well with how we are going to remember how we respond to risk, because when we respond to risk, we know that it matters. It completely matters to respond to risk, especially when it comes to project management. So that is my quick discussion on risk management. Quick, down, dirty, and easy. And so let's review real quick what it is that we want to do, because risk management is really what project management is all about. So as you go through putting together the work breakdown structure, as you go through putting together the project network, as you go through looking at all of the work and how it relates and how it interrelates and how you have successors and predecessors and how group interactions are dominant within the project that you're working on and the risk involved with that, and how you go back and you look at your work breakdown structure again and how you see where risk might play a role in the successful completion of that project. There are so many things involved as you go through and through your project, and as you reiterate it through your mind, these things will always come to the forefront as you're always thinking about getting ahead of the project. You're always thinking about preventing what could happen to your project and send it off the tracks, and you want to bring it right back onto those tracks. So first thing you do is you identify those risks. So get together with your team and brainstorm. Okay, that's risk management at its best. Okay, once you get those risks, ideal if you can categorize them, maybe have somebody on the team categorize them, redistribute them, and get an idea of what and how they are weighed on against the project. Determine the severity by understanding the probability of that risk occurring and the impact of that risk to your project. then you need to respond to it. You need to have a responsive plan to that risk. Sometimes a risk response might generate and create some additional work for your project. And that's why you want to identify risk, because then you have to roll back to your work breakdown structure, and you're going to have to add that risk plan into that WBS. And there may be some costs associated with that. So that's another reason why we want to generate and evaluate risk. Okay, and when we respond to that risk, we think about why it matters, right? Why it matters, M-A-T-R. And we have choices. We can mitigate that risk and develop a plan within the project to alleviate and lessen that risk event if it should occur. We can avoid that risk altogether. And sometimes that might be some adjustment to the scope statement, maybe an adjustment to the scope of the work. Or it could be an identified risk that will completely derail the project and it's not a risk worth taking, which would basically cancel the project. We can transfer the risk. Like I was speaking to you earlier, we know that through transfer, we can purchase insurance, or we can identify some sort of contract vehicle that we can bring and partner with another company. So that may be a shared risk, but we're still transferring that risk, right? And then lastly, we just accept the risk, right? We just accept the fact that it's going to be fine, and if this risk event should occur, we'll be able to manage it during the course of the project. So that, in a nutshell, is my lecture to you for risk management. It's a fun time to talk about a project when you're looking at risk, because you're really trying to figure it out. You're really trying to identify and be forward thinking to see if you can get in front of those risks. And you hope they don't happen, but if they do, you can always say, hey, I told you so. Good thing we put together that plan for that risk. So good luck. If you have any questions about risk management, let me know. That's my lecture on risk. Best of luck to you, and like I said, reach out to me with any questions. I'll do the best I can to get back to you.